Welcome everyone. We're just waiting for a few minutes for people to join. As a first request from our side, if we could ask everyone to sort of rename themselves. So if you could go in and change how your name appears, if you could use the format that you might see with some of us on the call, where if you could put your name first, followed by your organization, that'll be great. Also to say, we have an interpretation channel open. We have a Spanish and an English channel open. You will see that at the bottom of the toolbar of your screen. If you could select English, if you want to hear, if you're English speaking and you want to hear the conversation in English, and if you are Spanish speaking, you could select the Spanish channel as well. Again, some housekeeping. I think there are a few questions that are in the chat, which we would welcome your sort of answers to. But I think the format of the meeting is going to be one where we have panelists who are going to be speaking. Given that we have such a big audience, it's going to be hard for us to unmute and sort of manage people who raise their hands if they have a question. So we request that you put questions in the chat function. And we would also request if you could specify who the question is for from the panelists. That would help us to be able to curate the questions. And we do have a session, a time slot a bit later, where we will open up to questions from the audience. So with that, maybe we should begin. Welcome everyone to this session on localization in practice, driving forward diverse and locally led humanitarian action. I'm Bhavya Srinivasan and I work with the STAR Network, and today I'm joined by an exciting panel and a diverse panel. On the panel we have Samar Muharram from the Arab Renaissance for Democracy and Development, ARDD in short. We have Matthew Cogan from Irish Aid. We have Ugo EQ Perrin from SEXA, and we have Anita Katakuri from Oxfam. The localization conversation and debate, I'm sure, is familiar to everyone on this panel and in the audience. And it has long been one that has been quite conceptual and theoretical. We also recognize and acknowledge that realizing a truly locally led humanitarian system that is driven by local needs, local aspirations, local expertise, and local leadership is complex, and tangible change is yet to permeate the sector. However, the needle has moved, and we do see change in different parts of the system, from the facilitation of locally led humanitarian networks, funding mechanisms that provide equitable access to local organizations, to changes in governance systems and shaping of more equitable and locally driven partnerships. So today I'm joined by an exciting and diverse panel to share some of their experiences and offer us some practical examples of how locally led humanitarian action is being driven by different stakeholders within the humanitarian system. So I'm going to turn to our panelists. Our first panelist is Samar Muharram. She is the CEO of the Arab Renaissance for Democracy and Development, ARDD in short, a local organization in Jordan whose aim is to promote, protect, and defend human rights through litigation and offering free legal services to marginalized and vulnerable, um, to those who are marginalized and vulnerable to access justice. She'll be sharing with us her experiences in driving humanitarian action at the front line. Samar, thank you so much for joining us today. We'd like to hear from you as a local organization. What are some of the new emerging opportunities or challenges that you see more and more in your context in pioneering locally led action? And how do you deal with the challenges on a daily basis?
Thank you, Pavia, and I would like to thank this marvelous big group of attendees. It's an example of greater buy-in to the concept of localization or to the agenda of localization. Really, we thank the engagement for local actors from around the world to be part of these discussions, and hopefully we will be able one day to invite you to become one of our, let's say, guests in locally led discussions as well in different regions. What urges us or pushing us to keep doing what we are doing, the discussions, being engaged in such discussions, is the need. The need, what is urging us to be so vocal about the localization agenda and towards more sustainable impacts to everyone investment in these platforms and in other platforms, that we really want to see a change that is meeting our aspirations and our desires to have more sustainable impact to our efforts as local actors and international actors. The rationale behind this is beyond the need itself, is the value behind the localization discussions, which is it's towards more a diverse investment, a diverse inclusion and responses, a diverse representation for different groups we are talking on their behalf, and we want to hear their voices. The other value behind the localization agenda is the equity that we are all hoping to see in different conferences or in different concepts, that we are all calling for more equitable actions that has more fair in distributing aid or distributing resources or even distributing power among the different actors. The other value that we feel that it's emerging more and more is the democracy value. By itself, the localization is empowering the local actors to have their say, to be represented, to be present as well. And the last one is the credibility value, that we are all working towards more credible, transparent aid system. And inshallah, we hope that it will emerge soon. The other rationale behind what we are doing is the political correctness. I think there is more now talks about localization. It's towards a real reform in the system, and it's the political system that we need to change to achieve what we want. We are talking more and more about power dynamics and how we can create a more decent, let's say, interventions that take into consideration what is the right engagement for the all actors from different backgrounds to be there. Also, there is a symbolic significance to the localization agenda, and in many fronts and international platforms calling for localization, we start to hear things about how it feels and about the psychological and social aspect about the involvement of local actors. The emotional factor behind localization is as important as the economic and the political factors, and we would like to shed the light on the agency of different agents of a change, how they feel when they feel they are being marginalized, or there is a talk about the guardianship concept, that they feel that there is other coming to take care of you, showing you how you are supposed to live, how you're supposed to behave. All of these things that they push us to focus on the symbolic significance behind the localization. This and more in Jordan and in the Middle East. Based on the needs, again, we established a locally led coalition called JONAF. Now it has around 40 members from local actors. We started in 2016, and it took us 4 years until we are more recognized and visible, and we have like we have the opportunity to participate in decision making. When we started JONAF, most of the local actors, they are coming from the development world, and the humanitarian concept is not really invested in. So we tried to merge the agenda. So we're working on four main pillars: localization, building the capacity of a humanitarian response, and to have the right relief, let's say, components within our operations. Decentralization, because part of the localization is to be truly decentralized and empower those in the front lines to have the right capacities. And after that, there is the 1325, because we need to focus on women-led organizations and the role of women to respond in time of crisis. So we can see that localization is start to be more technical, more cross-cutting and multidisciplinary and multi-layered intervention, that it starts by building the capacities of the actors, but in the same time engaged in the governance issues of the countries and have the right tools to engage in discussions with our governments to start with, and then with the international systems. Just a clear example, after 10 years in the Syria crisis, we have in Jordan, as you know, 16 different camps for refugees, but one of the most significant camp is the Zaatari camp. Until now, after 10 years of a crisis, we have around 50 aid organizations working in that camp and only 2 local NGOs. And for us, it's a waste of opportunity that we did not manage to transfer knowledge on camp management, on emergency response, on how to engage with refugees' needs, daily life of needs inside the camps. And I consider that as an urgent call for us to change the system. It's not right, like only 2 local NGOs were able to be engaged in a very clear global, let's say, response that everyone was talking about, but not that many pushed for the engagement of local actors to be true change agents in that agenda. In terms of the challenges, you asked me about the challenges. There are many challenges, and again, it's multi-layered level of challenges. To start with is to creating the will towards the change in the system. So now we are focusing a lot about the creation of a coalition of willing, and we want to engage others and to have them on board. The other issue that we are facing is the investment in both worlds in the same time. And we are trying to get the best of both systems, the international systems and the local system at the same time, but that requiring from us to invest both in the local actors level, building their capacity, engaging them at the same time, doing these changes on the international system to have the right opportunity. And sometimes you need to do it in both languages at the same time. And that is also adding to our workload as leading actors for the localization agenda. Then you have issues related to funding and investment in the localization agenda, which we don't see it materialized yet. Recently, as RDD or as JONAF, we did a study. Only until now, 4% of the international aid is channeled directly to the local actors, and that would put a restriction on the ability of such coalitions to have sustainable resources, to have the right capacities to engage. Last one is the technology and the know-how, and to catch up with this very dynamic field, which requires research and translate that research into Arabic so you can share with others. So there is a huge need for improving our think tanks in the region to be part of this movement, academia, also the media itself. We need to raise awareness about the people, for the people to be part of this movement. I think I exceeded my 7 minutes, but thank you for the opportunity and for listening.
Thank you so much, Samar. That's really interesting to hear, like all of the different elements that are happening on the ground, and to hear about JONAF and how far it has come since 2016, because we've been in conversation about it for some time now. Thank you so much. We will come back to Samar when we have with some questions from the audience a little later. But moving to the next panelist we have is Matthew Cogan, who's the Deputy Director of the Humanitarian Unit at Irish Aid. Irish Aid being the Irish government's program for overseas development. Matthew has worked in the humanitarian sector in different roles, and he brings comprehensive understanding of the aid sector complexity. So welcome, Matthew, and thank you for being here. We'd like to hear from you, your thoughts on whether donors have the power to reform the humanitarian aid system to being one that is more locally owned and driven by needs, and what are some of the contexts within which a donor can realize or advocate for this reform?
Thank you very much. Good afternoon from sunny Dublin, and thanks to Start Fund for organising this, and thanks also to all of the participants that I've connected today, as well as my fellow panelists. As well as saying thank you, I also need to say sorry, because I'm going to need to leave this session early. But luckily, my boss Frank Smith is also on the line and will be available to answer questions for Ireland afterwards. So I hope you save up some nice tricky questions for him at the end. I'd like to touch on 4 issues in my 7 minutes. The first of all, just a kind of a personal reflection of localization and why, for me, it's so important. Secondly, I'll talk a little bit about Ireland's experience as a donor, but the challenges that we faced, as well as some of the insights that we've generated. Thirdly, what I feel donors can do to support localization. And fourthly, what collectively as a sector, as an ecosystem, we can all do together to push the agenda forward. From a very personal side, I cut my teeth in the humanitarian world, working hand in hand with a local NGO on the border of Pakistan and Afghanistan, starting nearly 20 years ago. And that experience really formed me, because I could see up front the power of local organizations and connecting with the people that they serve, the efficiencies that they have, and that they're on the ground, and the untapped expertise. But I think I also saw the opposite side, where you also have large international organizations that come in without that approach, and the significant downsides in terms of inefficiencies and ineffectiveness that very international driven approach. So for me, it's localization is something that I feel very passionately about. It's very close to my heart. In terms of our experience as a donor, I can share a few things that I think also might be of relevance to other donors as well, though of course everything happens within its own context. In terms of challenges, there are significant challenges to promoting localization. I think for sure politically, every donor's fear is having a story in the newspaper or a scandal that is damaging the aid program. And I think that creates a certain risk aversion sometimes in how we allocate our assistance. Structurally, most donors, humanitarian assistance is given from HQ, from the capital. So we work through intermediaries, to our partners in the UN system, civil society, and the Red Cross. And they all have their own challenges in promoting localization. So it's not something that we can switch on and off, because we are dependent on them to be able to do it. We also lack good data on localization. We're often, our conversations with our partners on localization are reduced to just counting how much funds was on granted to local partners, and we miss so much of the richness of relationships between international and national organizations. So that's a challenge for us in that. I think also culturally there's a challenge. Our risk-based approach tends to focus on the downside of things, and rather than the upside and the opportunities that bring localization brings to us. And again, that promotes a kind of an approach that tends to stick with what you know, or the familiar faces that we're used to dealing with. We do have some insights though as well that may be of use. Over the last number of years, we've had a strong policy commitment to localization. And in terms of our advocacy, we're quite consistent on that through our partners, particularly to the larger multilaterals as well, that we are very much promoting it. In terms of our funding allocation, we've moved to multi-annual funding to our NGO partners on the expectation, perhaps naively, that would enable localization to happen. That hasn't really taken place, and the progress has been slow and in some cases disappointing. And so I think there's a lesson learned for us to see that it's not easy to do localization, and such a significant shift and turning the direction of the Titanic is something that will take time, but will also take accountability and targets to be set. And I think that goes back to the point about having good indicators and data of localization. We're also supporting pilot initiatives through the START Fund that are trying to get over this barrier between global funding pools and local organizations, and actually pilot this approach of directly funding national organizations from global pots. So we're really excited about that and looking forward to sharing the insights that generates. In terms of what donors can do as donors writ large, for sure, I think multi-annual funding has to be the start of it. There's no way you can do localization on 6 months timescale projects, even 12 months. It's just not going to be possible. We need to take a long-term approach to that, and that's not possible unless we do multi-annual funding. In terms of our own moves, we'll be actually moving to a 5-year multi-annual funding cycle for our humanitarian NGO partners, as an expression of putting our money where our mouth is on that. Again, this point on data, what gets measured gets done. So we need to set targets. We need to have reliable data that we can use to have informed discussions on localization. And when partners aren't moving as far ahead as we'd like, we need to then ask why and understand better what's going on. I think also the reinvigoration of the grand bargain process provides an opportunity that donors can use to try to promote localization across the board to scale. Collectively, as a humanitarian ecosystem, I think we need to make localization political. I really like what Samar said about talking about equity, about power distribution, about democracy. Localization can't just be a technical question of increasing efficiencies. I think we really need to bring it into a bigger conversation about decolonization of the aid industry. I think we also need to document and disseminate the successes of localization. Where things are working, we need to be able to tell the story of that, so that risk assessments in terms of shifting to a localized approach are not only focusing on the negative risks, but also the opportunities. And I think we also need to contrast that with the negative sides of the current approach that we have, and certainly something that speaks to my own experience back in the deserts of Afghanistan and Pakistan. I think we need to bring governments into the conversation as well. From what I've seen, most of the discussions around localization is very much within the NGO world and then the UN world. Ultimately, it's governments that need to be accountable to their own populations, their own citizens. Now, in many cases, that's not possible, but in many cases it is. And so we need to involve them in that somehow, both at a local level as well as at a national level. And my last point is about having a women-led approach to humanitarian action. So localization can't be gender blind. I think it needs to be gender transformative. And having women-led approaches to humanitarian, I think, is a way to do that. So with that, I'll close. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much, Matthew. Those are really interesting insights, and nice to see that there are changes that are happening in the donor world in terms of like some of the conversations we have in terms of funding and access to resources, etc., as well, in terms of what you were saying about move towards a multi-year funding. Thank you for your time, and I'm glad that Frank Smith is on the call as well, and any we direct any questions to Frank. Thanks so much for your time, Matthew. Our next panelist is Anita Katakuri, and she is a humanitarian campaigns and policy advisor at Oxfam. She's been working in Oxfam's humanitarian and advocacy team for over 10 years and focuses on humanitarian financing, system reform, and localization. Welcome, Anita, and thank you for joining the panel today. We'd be happy if you could share with us a little bit on your experience of being part of an INGO that's going through a transformation process to meet its localization goals. What are some of the practical elements that influence and enable this shift? Basically, reimagining a complementary role being guided quite a bit from a bottom-up perspective.
Thanks, Bhavya, and to my fellow panelists and all the participants that have joined. It's a big question, and I'm not sure I'll cover everything in 7 minutes, but let me start off by saying Oxfam is still learning how to best or how best to practically shift into a more complementary role. And like many other agencies, including those who've joined this call, we've made some progress, but not consistently or in all places where it's needed. I'm honored to be here to share some of the shifts we have made, but I'm also thankful for organizing spaces like this where we can listen and learn from others. The catch to your question is the being guided by a bottom-up perspective. That's the heart of the challenge, I think. How we work, who we work with, what skills we recruit, the structures and systems we use to operate. That transformation process, as you called it, requires a really wide range of change. But those big practical enablers of change in Oxfam, there are 4 that stand out to me. So first, it's been setting a clear strategy to support local humanitarian leadership aligned to our strategic plan and the commitments we made when we signed up to the Grand Bargain and Charter for Change. Sounds quite boring, but actually without that strategy and the common objectives and targets within it, there wouldn't be a framework for our efforts. And much of the change that Oxfam is undergoing is to align to that vision articulated in our strategy and our humanitarian approach. I think the biggest impact of this strategy has been to conceptually change our starting point in humanitarian contexts. It's not everywhere, but in many places we've shifted our focus from traditional partnership response work to seeing our role in support of local actors and further sometimes a network of local actors. And that conceptual shift in starting point has led to real practical changes. And it's also made us more attractive as an international partner to local actors. There's a network of 8 Somali organizations working across Somaliland, Puntland, and South Central Somalia called the Nexus Platform. I think there's someone in the audience from the Nexus Platform that focus on collaborative, locally led triple Nexus programming. So really pretty amazing work. And it was because of Oxfam's strategy and approach to localization and based on our experiences in Somalia and Somaliland that the Nexus platform approached Oxfam and asked if we would act as an international fund manager for their network. Another big enabler of change has been setting up new kinds of funding mechanisms that strengthen local leadership and support networks of responders. So we're really trying to imagine or reimagine our role as a fund intermediary. And if I'm personally choosing which practical enabler has led to the most change driven from the ground, it's this one. I'm going to take you through a few examples of this because I think it's really important. So in Myanmar, for example, Oxfam's been working with a network of 9 local organizations in Kachin state, and embedded within this broader program is an emergency response funding mechanism, or I'll call it an ERM. The ERM fund in Kachin is managed by committee, so comprised of 2 representatives from the local network, one from another local organization not in the network who's well connected and knows the local context, and then 1 representative from Oxfam. So Oxfam's role on the committee is pretty strictly in facilitation, and most of the decisions are done by the ERM committee. The fund is straightforward. The committee set up criteria which triggers the fund activation, and once activated, the network members can apply for funds within a certain time frame. So we had a similar plan in our 5-year Empowering Local and National Humanitarian Actors program in Uganda and Bangladesh, but this time we set up 2 different funds. One that was managed by district committees, district or local committees focused on capacity strengthening work prioritized within their districts and within their networks, and another to provide seed funding for local responders to new and rapid onset crises similar to the ERM fund in Myanmar, with the one difference being that anyone in the district could apply so long as one applicant was part of the ELNA program. And while this latter fund, that quickly became a space for consortia response work, and it supported a lot of local to local partnerships. And yes, it was a great space for response work. There's also a great space for learning while doing and greater collaboration. These are just 3 countries. We've got examples elsewhere. We've set up ERM funds in a multi-year DRR program in Asia Pacific and Central America, which have focused on small scale emergencies and early action. We've set up another kind of fund specific to refugee-led organizations in northern Uganda, and on and on. Each time we trial a new funding mechanism that strengthens local leadership, we as Oxfam learn more about how our role could be different and how we can imagine our role to be complementary to the great work we see local actors designing and delivering. The third big enabler of change has been in rethinking our partnership approach to include networks and informal organizations, but also to find ways to step out from that kind of leading role. For example, in that ELNA program I mentioned before in Uganda and Bangladesh, that worked through the mobilization and funding of networks at the local level. So we had more than 250 local actors in both countries that were supported by what were called in the program supporting partners, who were trusted subnational and national NGOs, including 2 NGO networks. And that program was led by the 5 supporting partners in Bangladesh and 4 in Uganda, who also facilitated high quality technical support to other local actors in their district. So Oxfam's role there was to support the supporting partners. And it wasn't a traditional subcontracting partnership model. It was, the supporting partners were co-designers. They led most of the implementation, and we consciously took a step back and provided technical and facilitation support to the supporting partners, as well as that facilitating funding from the IKEA Foundation. What I found really exciting is in that change of our partnership model is that it's also started to change our approach to capacity strengthening, and we're looking at the needs of networks of responders now rather than individual organizations. And when you start working with networks, you also start seeing a kind of exponential or a much wider sharing of capacity strengthening. So stronger local organizations were able to support growing smaller organizations and informal groups working together, leveraging their strengths and mandates. And lastly, but certainly not the least, a big enabler for change has been, I think, something Matthew mentioned earlier has been the new systems for data gathering and documenting learning that we've set up. So 5 years ago, when we signed up to the Charter for Change and Grand Bargain, we realized that we didn't have the right kind of data to tell us if we were making progress on our localization commitments. Since then, we've been adapting existing data systems to generate ever more accurate data on funding to partners, from our planning and reporting tools to funding pipeline systems, future project and grant management systems, etc. The fruits of this work is actually, there's a delay. We're only seeing the fruits now. And while the adaptations weren't very difficult to develop, improving reporting to new questions and indicators takes time, but it's worth it. This investment is helping us understand where we are now and know where we need to make changes. I'll end there. I think I have exceeded my time, but I appreciate the opportunity.
Thank you so much, Anita. That's really interesting. It like sort of speaks to a lot of the work the Start Network's also trying to do in its own like vision for localization. I have a ton of questions, but I will save them for later maybe. Our final panelist is Hugo EQ Perrin, who is the National Director at ASEXA, a network of 48 community health organizations in Guatemala who promote integrated community health with gender equity and cultural appropriateness for excluded populations through training and capacity building processes, and with impact advice for the right to health and quality of life. Thank you, Hugo, for joining us today. I think the question we wanted to ask you is whether you could actually share your journey as a leader of a local network that's very much community-based. What does a networked approach bring to the aid system, in your opinion? And how are power balances tackled through collaboration?
Muchas gracias. En primer lugar, quisiera enviar un cordial saludo de esta otra parte del mundo, desde Guatemala, especialmente del pueblo maya. Mi nombre es Hugo Icuperén. Yo soy de origen maya cachiquel, acá de Guatemala. He tenido la oportunidad de trabajar más o menos por 30 años directamente en el campo de la salud, del desarrollo y de la ayuda humanitaria. Guatemala es un país pluricultural. Guatemala es un país multilingüe. Hay 23 diferentes idiomas. Sin embargo, el idioma oficial es el español. Creo que es importante resaltar de que la mayor parte de la población precisamente es de origen indígena, pero esta población también es la que es altamente rural y por cuestiones históricas es la población más excluida y también olvidada. En ese sentido, también tengo el orgullo de decir de que soy parte de esa población, porque soy de origen maya, y convivo con la gente. Actualmente soy director de la Asociación de Servicios Comunitarios de Salud ASEXA, que es una red de organizaciones, de 48 organizaciones locales de salud, desarrollo y de ayuda humanitaria en Guatemala, con 42 años de experiencia en este campo de trabajo. En ese sentido, hemos logrado confluir una red con una gobernanza directamente desde los grupos comunitarios y locales de salud asociados, que conforman una asamblea, una junta directiva y son los máximos entes de decisión para esta asociación. Esto lo estoy compartiendo como punto de partida en el sentido de que ASEXA es actualmente la organización líder del Centro HUB en Guatemala. Este Centro HUB en Guatemala, actualmente ASEXA la lidera, pero también está compuesto porque están aglutinados muchas otras organizaciones. Organizaciones también propiamente locales, comunitarias, que son parte también de la base de ASEXA, pero también hay otras organizaciones de sociedad civil, ONGs locales, movimientos sociales, con quienes también hemos confluido para precisamente darle vida a lo que es el Centro HUB en Guatemala. Para nosotros ha sido importante confluir y organizarnos como un Centro HUB sobre la base de diferentes afinidades que ya hemos tenido. Porque de alguna manera nosotros conocemos la historia de los pueblos, la historia de nuestros pueblos, la historia de las comunidades como un punto de partida para entender sus diferentes contextos, sus diferentes luchas y también sus diferentes perspectivas. También es muy importante para nosotros conocer precisamente las culturas. Digo las culturas porque tampoco son homogéneas. Por ejemplo, cada pueblo con su propia cultura, cada pueblo con su propio idioma, con su propia forma de ver y entender el mundo, enmarcado en algo que nosotros le llamamos cosmovisión. En ese sentido, también cada pueblo y cada localidad, con sus diferentes niveles de riesgo, con sus diferentes niveles de amenazas, de vulnerabilidades. Y también pueblos que tienen diferentes tipos de liderazgos. Liderazgos formales e informales. Cuando hablo de liderazgos formales, posiblemente tengan que ver con liderazgos y organizaciones también gubernamentales, pero también hay liderazgos y hay autoridades propios de las comunidades que nosotros le llamamos autoridades ancestrales. Para nosotros es importante tener este colectivo que parte desde abajo, que conoce a la gente y tiene credibilidad ante la gente. Creo que eso es importante. También ya mencionaba la necesidad de respetar la cosmovisión de los pueblos, porque la cosmovisión de los pueblos tiene varios principios que quisiera con ustedes compartir, como por ejemplo, precisamente el trabajo colectivo, el trabajo en red. En los idiomas mayas, la palabra red se traduce de esta manera, la llamamos cat, y red lo ejemplifican generalmente con esa red que cubre, eh, que cubre el sagrado maíz. Maíz es el alimento principal del pueblo maya, y en una red es en donde guardan el sagrado maíz. Entonces guardan un producto principal, digamos, que hay que cuidarlo. Y entonces una red que es compuesto por muchos componentes, ¿no? Por muchas pitas. Y que si una de estas pitas se rompe, pues debilita la capacidad de cubrir este gran producto. También otro de los principios es precisamente la ayuda mutua, la reciprocidad, la honestidad, el respeto a los mayores, el respeto y la convivencia con la madre tierra. Se considera al ser humano como parte de un entorno, como parte del cosmos, y creemos de que eso es importante. El Centro HU, entonces, pretende fortalecer esas capacidades y esos liderazgos. También apoya en la toma de decisiones colectivas, respetando las diferentes formas culturales y también locales. También es importante la canalización de las relaciones entre el gobierno local, el gobierno municipal, el departamental y también el nacional. También creemos importante fortalecer las capacidades técnicas, por ejemplo, para hacer cómo convertir pequeñas ideas en proyectos que puedan salir desde las propias comunidades. También ha sido importante para nosotros ser canales de intercambios de experiencias entre una comunidad a otra, entre una organización a otra. Y también para nosotros ha sido importante entender esta ayuda y este acompañamiento humanitario en acompañar también luchas más profundas como por ejemplo el acceso a tierras. Hay mucha gente acá que no tiene tierra. El acceso a servicios básicos como la salud, la educación, la vivienda. Inclusive acompañar procesos tan difíciles como por ejemplo cuando una comunidad es declarada inhabitable. Es declarada inhabitable por su alto riesgo, pero sin embargo el gobierno no es capaz de trasladarlo a otro lado porque simplemente no hay dónde trasladarlos, y tener que seguir acompañando esa situación difícil que tienen. Inclusive también acompañarlos en lo que nos pasa algunas veces de algunas persecuciones políticas por oponernos a los sistemas. COVID-19 ha sido también un momento importante para, de alguna manera, rescatar, valorar prácticas tradicionales de prevención y de atención ante la pandemia. También para nosotros, quiero compartirles, es importante acompañar algunos retos que hemos encontrado. Y posiblemente estos retos trascienden. Por ejemplo, la resistencia al cambio, ¿verdad? Porque siempre habrá resistencia al cambio. Entonces también en este asunto de la resistencia al cambio, creemos importante cambiar mentalidades. Por ejemplo, la mentalidad que hay desde abajo, en el sentido de que nosotros no tenemos poder, nosotros nacimos pobres y vamos a morir pobres. Esa mentalidad hay que cambiarla. O sea, hay que empoderar a la gente y decirles que tienen poder. Pero por el otro lado, también cómo canalizar y cómo analizar toda este embate de toda una globalización, ¿verdad? Una globalización que muchas veces no respeta lo local, no respeta las culturas y que generalmente le da más poder en la parte económica y en la parte política a los ya poderosos. Entonces también estos cambios para nosotros son bien importantes. Yo quisiera terminar señalando y valorando este trabajo de Star Network, primero por organizar este evento. Para nosotros es un poco difícil tener esta especie de diálogos, por ejemplo, con donantes principales de gobiernos, y tener este diálogo, por ejemplo, con organizaciones internacionales. En este caso, yo saludo y respeto mucho la experiencia que tenemos con Oxfam en otros lados, pero también hay puntos siempre encontrados, ¿verdad? Positivas y negativas. También saludo esta idea de impulsar este trabajo en red y un cambio de paradigma. Un cambio de paradigma no es fácil, siempre es difícil, y tener la visión de una ayuda humanitaria mucho más integral y dirigida localmente. Es un reto en donde tenemos que estar juntos porque, como ya se mencionó, tenemos que verlo como proceso en donde tenemos que buscar objetivos comunes, aunque los caminos sean diferentes. Muchas gracias.
Gracias, Hugo. Thank you so much for your insightful reflection on what is happening within your network and how things are changing on the ground or not changing on the ground as well. As we started a few minutes late, we're running a little bit out of time. So I'm just going to pick up maybe two questions that I have seen in the chat. One is to Anita in terms of the approach that Oxfam has taken. And it also speaks a little bit to what Hugo was talking about in terms of mindset. I guess the question is more on the fact that there has progress that has been made, but there's still a project mindset that is quite deep-rooted rather than an organizational approach. So how can we change this mindset among all NGOs, all actors who are working in this space?
Thank you for the question. I think that was Rajan from Malteser. It's difficult, and let's just kind of, reflecting back how you reframed the question, Bhavya, it is that project mindset is everyone has it, I think through the humanitarian system, from donors to UN agencies and INGOs and local and national organizations that we work with. I think it's a difficult trap to come out of. I think it requires champions within organizations to regularly and constantly challenge new funding proposals. And I'm thinking particularly about the INGO and how it's worked inside Oxfam, right? Whenever a new bid gets pulled together, there's someone inside that's like, wait, hold up, are we thinking about this in the right way? Are we being expansive enough? Is it going to help our commitment to investing in local humanitarian leadership? And that kind of check, I think, is inside by champions, is really critical. Ugo mentioned something about ancestral authority, and I think that gave me chills, because there's something very powerful in that, because I think that we need those leaders to challenge elsewhere, right? Local organizations that work in their communities, international agencies that work in their communities. So you need the internal champions, but you need external challengers as well. I think that regardless of if you have those champions or those challenges, it's still going to take time, and you need to have multi-year funding to give you that time and space to switch modes, right? Because it is about changing gears and changing models of working. And I can tell you, in the ELNA program in Uganda and Bangladesh, as well as in other places, that was a 5-year program, and it was really only after year 1 that these district leaders, these local NGOs that led from the district level, it's only then that they kind of were like, oh, right, the expectations are different now. We have to be formulating and driving things very differently now. And I think, that if you don't have a multi-annual funding and flexible funding, you're not going to be able to have that kind of shift.
Thank you so much for that, Anita. I think we have one more question, and I think this is directed to Frank from a donor perspective. So I think, again, it's from Rajan. The question is, I have observed that in-country level initiatives have 2 broad dimensions, technical and political. But to achieve these goals, donors have a role to advocate to blending both these aspects, as both are critical and important to achieving the goal of localization within countries. So what is your perspective on this issue? How can the donor make it possible in countries, and how can the donor communities make it simpler rather than more complex, where there's a tendency to drive a more technocratic roadmap?
Sure, thank you, and thank you for having Ireland here today. We're very pleased to be here, because we're genuinely interested in promoting localization, and we're genuinely interested in learning. And I've been following the chat on the right-hand side of my screen, which and I have noted here Rajan's name because I've been following what he's been saying both to you and to others in the audience. And I suppose I will kind of default a little bit on Matthew's point about, and I'm not sure I fully get the question, but I'll try and answer it as best I can. There are political and technical aspects to it. The political aspect, I think, is particularly of interest here, and that goes to education to some extent, including educating those in the donor system, not very much those in the donor system, in the sense that we very much favor localization as an organization, Irish Aid, but we do need, obviously, it's a change, it's a new dimension, it's something we welcome. The term decolonization is used, obviously it's something that's a policy perspective that we very strongly support, and we make that case to the political level, which decides on where the taxpayers' the donor country taxpayers' money goes, but also to our NGOs, because they are very often, some of them are international, and they are on the ground, and we're expecting and hoping that they will move this policy forward. that's where the longer period for the multi-year platform is needed. I take the point, somebody has made the point 5 years isn't very long, and fully agree with that. But in a system that's used to a 1 or 2 years or getting to 3 years, 5 years is getting longer. Obviously, we would hope to get that longer still. The point, and if I'm going a little bit away from the question, sorry, but I'm following also some of the comments on the side, and the point about, because Matthew did make the point about risk, and that was taken up by a number of people in their comments, and that's part of the political discussion that's around this. And we very much take the point that local NGOs, the risk, they're not risky, in the general sense, and Matthew in no way would have suggested or intended to label them in that way. And the point was made that there have been crashing problems with some of the bigger, some of the very biggest organizations, and obviously, given the amounts of money involved, the risk comes home to haunt us from time to time. So from that point of view, I just want to clarify that Matthew certainly wasn't in any way suggesting that local NGOs were riskier. And the point that Ugo was making very much about root causes and proximity to the issues are very much part of this discussion in favor of localization. And if I could just make one final point, just maybe again slightly out of tandem, but the same principle applying. I think Mr. Lowcock, who many of you will know from his role in UN OCHA and who is leaving, he's delivering remarks tomorrow, I understand, which have already been covered today in the media. One of the lessons he has clearly learned from his time at the very pinnacle of the international organization system has been that the big organizations aren't listening to the people on the ground. The people who are receiving, the most vulnerable people who are receiving the assistance that his organization is receiving from countries like Ireland and elsewhere. And the same could apply in terms of, we need to listen more to the local NGOs. I mean, Ugo was making that point in his own way, in a very clear way. So from that perspective, the same principle applies. If Mark Lowcock is saying donors and big organizations must listen to what the people receiving assistance need, rather than telling them and giving them what they think they need, the same goes with the situation in relation to NGOs. We need to listen to those who are closest to the people that they're assisting, just as it was highlighting. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Frank. Sorry to cut you off there. We're slightly over. We're running slightly over. So I just wanted to maybe ask Samar just one question before we start wrapping up. I think, Samar, there's a question around the competition between INGOs and local NGOs. I'm in the chat. Sorry, I just lost the question with my screen just switched. I think the question is, do you see competitive relationships between INGOs and local NGOs in some countries to some extent, making localization more challenging? And what's your experience from that?
Well, competition could be something positive as well if we both systems competing to do the best for our communities and beneficiaries, and to be more efficient and to give more examples to successes. That would be a good competition, and we urging both systems to really compete to achieve that. However, when we talk about competition as well, it could mean many things. Economic competition, or we are competing over funding or over presence or over legitimacy or visibility. And unfortunately, in each one of those, even in the political buy-in, we can sense some sort of harmful competition. And we think localization, or at least open dialogue around localization, it will make the harms or the consequences of this negative competition better and easier. How we solve this as well? By simplifying the system, not creating more bureaucracy levels to reach aid or to reach resources, or for the voices to be heard. And what we are seeing now, new trends because of the localization, that there are new emerging terminologies or financing systems that local actors will not be able to conquer or to walk through. And this is one of our concerns, is how to simplify the system, not to make it overcomplicated, to demonstrate the shared risks or the shared responsibility in a different way than what we are aspiring. Creating pool funds, for instance, not led by local actors, it would complicate the scene more, and it will be considered as if we are creating more resources to the big INGOs rather than supporting directly the local NGOs. And we had this discussion, Pavia, many times on the START network ability to localize some of their hubs, but how this is going to be managed and how we demonstrate really changes in the power dynamics in the system. This is what we would like to see. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Samar. And I do apologize to the panel and the audience that we've run a little over time. I think I might just end with asking Hugo, to give us in 1 minute, if you could let us know, as a closing statement, what is your call to action to your peers and other key actors in the humanitarian sector to drive forward locally led humanitarian action? If you could give us a 1 minute quick summary or a statement for a call to action, that'll be great.
Sí, muchas gracias. En Guatemala y en América Latina impulsamos lo que le llamamos el buen vivir, que implica un cambio de paradigma. Un cambio de paradigma en el sentido de tener al ser humano en relación a la madre tierra, al cosmos, para vivir y convivir en comunidad. Comunidad significa 2 palabras, común, unidad. Muchas gracias.
Thank you so much, Hugo, for those words. I think that resonates with a lot of us here. And thank you to all the panelists for sharing so openly your insights and struggles and triumphs in navigating through the complexities of what we're trying to achieve collectively. And to the audience for joining today and asking some great questions. We will follow up over email with potentially like trying to go back to the panelists to get some answers to the questions that we didn't get to. For us, and just to wrap up, I think for us at START Network, we are inspired and want to amplify the work that's being done. We still have much to learn, like Anita said, and we're also learning about our own localization journey. And a lot of what the panelists have shared with us today reflects all the questions, the struggles and realities of what we're trying to do in terms of like our own effort to decentralize towards a more locally led system. But we believe that for this change to happen, there needs to be quite a fundamental shift to be able to create the systemic change, and no individual or entity can realize this on their own. And everyone has a part in advocating for change both internally and externally. And today we heard some examples that spoke exactly to this. And I think the challenge to all of us is to find ways to amplify, multiply, and scale such initiatives and also join them up for it to be more coherent as opposed to like dispersed pieces happening in like isolation. And we'd like to leave you today with a question that we think we would like for everyone to ask themselves, is what role can you and are you willing to, more importantly, play in moving towards a more truly locally led humanitarian system? Thank you all for being here today and being such a wonderful audience, being such a wonderful panelist, and we hope we can continue these conversations going forward. Thank you.
Thanks.